My name is Nia. Welcome to Decarcerating Care. I am the Administrative Coordinator for IDHA. As a visual description, I am a light-skinned, femme-presenting Black woman with long Black braids and a baby blue wall in the background, and some wires in the back. You can just see my apartment. So just a quick grief and genocide acknowledgement. First, giving credit to Sia, who we're taking inspiration from their approach to grief and genocide acknowledgements. And yeah, just wanting to remind everyone that showing up how you are, carrying what you are with all the things happening in the world right now, the grief with the election or however you may be feeling, the genocides like in Palestine, Congo, Sudan, everywhere they're all happening, just wanting to bring all those feelings and tensions and grief into the room and know that it is present and allowed here. And yeah, just want to make sure that we're attuning to everything people may be bringing with them into the space today. So thank you. All right, so a quick accessibility overview. Closed captioning is available. So if you would like to view that, you can click the Show Captions button to turn on the feature. And to access a full live transcript, click the arrow next to the Show Captions button and then view full transcript. And as you can see, ASL interpretation is also available. So we have Vanya and Valerie with us today. Thank you so much for being here. Technology and chat overview. So you can reach out to Noah if you have any technical issues today. So their name will be IDHA Tech. We are recording this panel to share with registrants later, just so everyone is aware. And as always, we invite you to join the conversation in the chat. So just keep in mind that the chat tends to be very active, as you can see. So we invite you to attune to your access needs, so you can click the chat button to hide this function if you desire to do so. And just another reminder that we will send out an anonymized transcript of this chat in our follow-up email, which will go out in a few days. When it comes to questions, panelists may not be able to answer all of them that arise, but we will save any questions received and hope to engage with them beyond this panel. So who is IDHA? The Institute for Development of Human Arts. We are a community of current and prior mental health service users and survivors, psychiatrists, psychologists, and other clinicians, activists, and artists who have come together to transform mental health care. What we do, we advance critical, effective, and scalable alternative approaches to mental health through collaborative education and community development. And how we are unique as an organization, we are unique by integrating experiential and academic knowledge. We challenge the idea that only those who work in the field of mental health are the experts by shifting power dynamics in a system that generally only privileges professional experience. And some community agreements for today. First is shared wisdom and expertise. Everyone brings their own expertise to this conversation, so we can gain from and respect each other's various expertise that we bring into the room. Collective liberation. Overcoming oppression aids everyone's liberation. It is our responsibility to challenge various forms of prejudice. We educate in the spirit of solidarity and hold each other accountable without criticizing who we are as people. And the last community agreement we have is listen like allies. We respect a wide diversity of choices and perspectives, even when we disagree, and we don't judge or invalidate other people's experiences. So these agreements apply to the chat as well. And we have a team member, Jesse, who will moderate and uplift these agreements if needed. Next is addressing conflict and harm. So we expect polyphony and disagreements to show up in the space. Our community agreements are designed to help us navigate these moments. So during the panel, we invite you to notice, where do you feel tension in your body? Is this from learning new ideas that challenge you? Is this because something said or done in the space reinforces oppression? And there is a link in the chat to IDHA's harm response form, where you can report harm in the space that you would like the team to address. IDHA credits spring up for supporting the development of these approaches to conflict and harm as well. And we aim to address everything that shows up, but we may not have capacity to address everything or meet all needs, but we will try our best within our capacity. And panel follow-up. So like I said, within a few days, you will receive an email, which will contain the panel recording, a closed caption transcript, an anonymized chat transcript, a reading and resource list, ways to stay in touch with panelists, and a panel feedback form. And yeah, so this is the panel format for today. In a few moments, we will get some words from our moderator, Reeti. And after that, we will introduce our panelists, and then there will be a panel discussion and Q&A. So now I'm going to hand it off to Reeti. Yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. I am deeply honored to be moderating today's panel. My name is Reeti. I use she, they pronouns. I'm currently a student at NYU studying psychoanalysis and critical theory. And as someone with lived experience with the coercive aspects of the mental health system, tonight's topic holds particular significance for me. For a brief visual description, I am a South Asian woman with brown and black hair that's pulled back, brown skin, and brown eyes. I'm also wearing a brown jacket, and I have a blurred background. Tonight, as we gather with the weight of the ongoing genocides and colonial crises in Palestine, Sudan, Congo, and elsewhere, I want to hold space for this collective pain, honoring the anger, grief, and resilience that we carry. I'm sharing a link in the chat with multiple links to GoFundMe campaigns for anyone able to directly contribute to those affected. These global struggles resonate deeply with our conversation tonight, which examines how systems of power enact control under the guise of protection, specifically within the mental health system in the United States. The use of legal mandates within the mental health system, including mandatory reporting and duty to warn or duty to protect laws, are fundamentally tied to colonial and carceral logics. Mental health practitioners are often required or pressured, whether by law or their workplaces, to report perceived threats. Rather than lead to care and support, such reports instead funnel individuals into punitive systems. This compels mental health practitioners to act as extensions of the state, blurring the line between caregiving and policing. These mandates vary considerably by state and institution, creating an environment of confusion and fear for both providers and those seeking care. Historically and presently, these practices disproportionately impact communities who are already surveilled and criminalized by the state, especially Black and Indigenous people of color and queer and trans people. They make individuals less safe by isolating them from their community and placing them in systems that criminalize rather than support. Mandated reporting and related practices reinforce paternalistic narratives that certain people are in need of intervention from authorities, stripping them of their autonomy and dignity. The consequences of mandated reporting extends far beyond those impacted, reverberating across communities and generations through the separation of children from their families, the severing of people from social safety nets, and the increase of medical and psychiatric trauma due to forced engagement with carceral systems. Research shows that these practices erode trust in the mental health system and influence whether and how people choose to engage with it. When someone seeks out mental health support, there is inherent hope for understanding, connection, safety, and healing. But when that encounter carries the possibility of surveillance or punitive action, fear and alienation are more likely outcomes. For the providers and advocates who enter this line of work to foster healing, the question is, what do we do in the face of these realities? Our panel tonight will address the carceral dynamics that underlie mandated reporting practices and explore how we can help cultivate a culture of care that prioritizes autonomy and non-coercive support. There are already many people organizing around alternatives to these practices, and tonight we're going to learn more about them. Movements like Mad Pride, Psychiatric Survivors, and Transformative Justice all offer us valuable lessons and insights. Each of our panelists, individuals with lived experiences in these systems, care practitioners and activists, and policy experts, will share their experiences in navigating and resisting these mandates. I extend a warm welcome to our panelists for tonight. Thank you all for joining us for this important conversation. I invite each of you to share a brief introduction with your pronouns, a visual description, and a bit about your personal or professional relationship to today's topic of legal mandates and mental health practices. So to begin, if we can start with Robyn.
Thank you, Reeti. Hi, everybody. My name is Robyn Mourning. My pronouns are she, her. And to give a brief visual description, I am a light-skinned Black biracial woman, and I have dark hair pulled back. I am wearing a olive green shacket, which is a shirt jacket, and I have a blurred background behind me, kind of cream colored. Um, I do have lived experience with various mental health and traumatic situations. And I also used to operate a mental health practice of my own where I worked with many individuals on their own healing journey and was honored to be alongside them as they navigated that process for themselves. Several years ago, I transitioned to full-time organizing and consulting with other care practitioners of all kinds in determining how we can provide care in a way that is liberatory focused, anti-carceral, and in conjunction with other movements around liberation from various systems of oppression and such. So that's primarily what I do now. I reside in on the ancestral lands of the Apache, Ute, and Cheyenne nations, colonized as Northern Colorado, and I'm really glad to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robyn. I'll pass it to Nicole.
Hi everyone, I'm Nicole Wynn. I use she, her pronouns. As a visual description, I'm a mixed race woman with medium length black hair, and I'm wearing a fuchsia zip hoodie sitting in front of a large bookcase. I'm calling in from Chicago, where I'm a professor of criminology, law, and justice, and I work with Arab and Muslim community organizations who are resisting national security programs that use the provision of mental health services and other social services to criminalize and pathologize Arab and Muslim communities. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Nicole. I'll pass it to Joyce.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Joyce McMillan. I am a person with lived experience. I am the founder of Just Making a Change for Families, better known as JMAC for Families. I am the creator of Mandate Support and Not Report. I am the co-chair of Now on the Front Door, the founder of Planned Parent Legislative Action Network, where we push legislation to create change that would give families autonomy, and also the co-chair of CAPTA, where we're looking to repeal some aspects of the CAPTA legislation, which is on a federal level. It stands for, I always get it messed up, Prevention and Treatment Act. Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act. I apologize, guys. And it's the place where money is designated to incentivize the separation of families. And that money could go into communities to support families remaining intact and live in a healthier life. I've been involved with many systems. It all started with the family policing system. And what I realized is each system uses a very similar formula to threaten your mental well-being. And many people may interact and show signs of mental health distress without having a mental health diagnosis, but it's only because these systems are that harsh. Thank you. Oh, and I'm sitting in Harlem, Black woman, cornrows in my hair currently, just chilling in my living room.
Thank you so much. I'll pass it to Shannon.
Hello, my name is Shannon Perez Darby, and I use she, her pronouns. I am joining you from the unceded territory of the Coast Salish and Duwamish, also known as Seattle, Washington. As a visual description, I am a light-skinned mixed race Latina. I have a white top on, silver hoop earrings, long brown dark hair, glasses, and behind me there's pictures of my family and some plants in my house. I joined this work from the anti-violence movement. So I've worked for the last 20 years, largely working inside my own queer and trans communities. I spent 10 years working with young people experiencing gender-based violence, which is how I came to this work specifically. I am a core member of the Mandatory Reporting is Not Neutral project, and my home organization is the Accountable Communities Consortium. I am also lucky to have an activist in residence with Just Beginnings Collaborative to have the time to focus on changing the conditions that lead to violence, abuse related to child sexual abuse and mandatory reporting. I'm happy to be here with y'all.
Thank you so much. I'll pass it to Carolyn.
Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for coming out tonight. My name is Caroline Muzzle Carlton. She pronouns work fine for me. Tonight, I am, let's see, I am a white person. I have dark hair. I'm getting some white streaks in there. I'm wearing black clothing, and I'm sitting in front of a window looking out on Holyoke, Massachusetts, which is the ancestral homeland of the Nipmuc and Pecumtuck peoples. Personal and professional relationship with this topic, for me, it began with personal. I'm going to provide just a bit of context because I think context is really key. It's something I want to talk about tonight, like understanding the context of individual experiences. So one of my experiences was as a young person, I had an experience where I terminated a pregnancy in a red state. After that experience, began to hear the voices of the protesters outside that Planned Parenthood calling me a murderer. These were really intense voices. I had heard voices before, but not quite like this or that accusatory. And in that moment where I really needed someone to sit down next to me and ask me what was going on, what I'd been through, and how they could be supportive, that's what I needed in that moment. But instead, what I got was law enforcement, who I assumed was there to pick me up for murder because that's what the voices were saying. And it led to a pretty violent encounter and ended up in a jail cell. So that was in my early 20s. For the past 16 years, I have worked as a mental health professional, trying to make sure that people get more of that dialogue and care that I was seeking in that moment. So I began my career as a mental health professional working on community support teams in Appalachia, Buncombe County, North Carolina. Met a lot of people there doing that work in the mountains and in shelters. And over the course of my career, I've worked in different settings. I'm now part of the Hearing Voices Network USA. I serve on its board. And I work for Wildflower Alliance, developing the Alternatives to Suicide approach, which is a non-carceral approach to suicide. I'm thrilled to also say, like, this month I will be with some inmates in a maximum security prison, one of the most carceral settings around, but I'm going to be with them so we can practice using this model so that inmates can support other inmates that are having thoughts of suicide so they don't end up dealing with guards and all the difficult things that can happen when you express those thoughts in extremely restricted settings. So super glad to be here with everybody, and that's just a bit about me.
Thank you so much for sharing your experiences and the background that will be informing your insights for today's panel. I guess I'll start with the first question. The question is, what is the biggest misconception about mandated reporting when it comes to mental health? What are the impacts? Why do you think there is so much confusion regarding mandated reporting? And how has this played out in your experience? We can start with Shannon, but anyone can jump in after.
Thank you. One of the biggest things I see around misconceptions related to mandatory reporting is that people have this really deep desire to call someone to fix it. That we really want there to be, that if we see something hard happening, there's a place we could call and the people over there will take care of it. And people take that belief and they really place it on family policing systems, on child protective services, using mandatory reporting. And they have this idea that if they make a mandatory report and they're seeing somebody who's experiencing harm, that person's going to get support and care. And if it were true, only if, that's what was happening. But what's actually happening is that a mandatory report is a referral for an investigation by the state. It is not inherently connecting someone to resources. And we have sort of an imagination that somehow we might be doing something helpful or that there's resource. People might get connected to resource at the far end of that system, but it is not inherently true that people are going to get resource. And what we know from the research that we have is that overwhelmingly people say that involvement in those systems and that mandatory reports make their situation worse. And I'm happy to put in the chat when I'm done the resources that say that and some of the research we have that says that. So I think this instinct that people have to say, okay, well, if I call, it'll get taken care of. That's part of what we have to divorce ourselves from as we make a better plans and cares of support for people so they can meaningfully, when people are experiencing harm, they can get meaningful care and support. But as long as people sort of imagine and believe that making mandatory reports are connecting someone to better care, it's a huge barrier into getting people what they actually need. I'll pause there and pass it to other panelists.
Yeah, I would like to chime in because thank you for that, Shannon. I think everything that Shannon said is important and relevant, but I think there's a bigger problem, and that is when people have a concern, they have no one to turn to because there is a fear of reporting. And you can't ask for help when that's happening. But outside of that, the people who diligently search to find a reason to report people, they're not motivated by care and concern of that person. They're motivated by the penalties that are attached to them not reporting. And that is why you will hear mandated reporters say things like better safe than sorry. When in doubt, pull them out and cover your own ass, because it's not about the safety of the person that they're reporting, it's about themselves. Mandated reporting is harmful, just the roots of it. It reminds me of a time in slavery when Black people were being chased around. When we look at who's involved in systems and people's inability to ask for help because of the fear attached to being reported, we then put people in a situation where people are chasing them around to prove an accusation that someone only reported to cover their own ass. And so it's just wrong from the foundation. Every fiber of it is wrong and not helpful. And I'll leave you with this. When we talk about mental health, we often say that many people living on the street are living in a homeless or a dehoused situation and experiencing some mental health challenges that could have contributed to them being houseless. But we trust that homeless people on the street will knock on your window and ask for change, or stand in front of a store opening doors asking for change. We don't know what they're going to do with that change, but they have identified a need that they are going to utilize that change to fulfill. But yet we don't trust families to say that I need help. And families are over-reported by the family policing system for things that could have been resolved just by providing a little bit of resource. Investigations, prosecution, none of those things mitigate the circumstance that the person is in front of the family policing system for, whether they self-reported or whether someone else reported them. And I'll pass it.
Thanks so much for that, Joyce. And it's also been my experience that with mandated reporting, and I think this comes from fear, people are often vastly over-reporting things, and even taking the law farther than what it even actually says. And I think, Joyce, you spoke really eloquent to some of the roots of that. And so I think to sort of dismantle some of that, we need facts to overcome fear. You know, just the facts are, we see a lot of people, you know, reporting folks for thoughts of suicide, claiming that they need to do this because of mandated reporter statute. But it's just not what the law says. Mandated reporter statutes don't mention suicide, and they don't mention thoughts and feelings either. That's another thing I just want to say, like, reporting people for thoughts and feelings, I think, is really problematic, because there's no police or hospital that really can help me explore those thoughts and feelings better than someone I know well and who understands the context of my life. So definitely, you know, I think there's part of this is about letting go of some of the fear. I think people grossly overestimate, like, you know, whether the consequences for keeping confidentiality for their clients. You know, I have people say, well, I'm afraid I could lose my license, Caroline. Okay, you're saying like this doesn't involve mandated reporting, but what if I lose my license? But again, I think it's really important to look at what are the facts. People that lose their license, I've actually searched, you know, case law, trying to find cases where people lose their license over not reporting, and they're just very hard to find. Speaking to attorneys that do those cases, if you're worried about losing license, what they say is don't have sex with your clients, don't support people under the influence, and don't, you know, do weird stuff with money. Those are what most of those cases involve. So I think, yeah, I love that we're starting off here with the roots of mandated reporting and what it actually says, because yeah, sometimes that definition I see get really stretched and really stressed. And when we come down to it, you know, sometimes folks are fearful, oh, something might happen and I might be investigated as a mental health professional. And I validate that fear. And also, you know, I'm someone that has been investigated in my role as a mental health professional because something happened on a unit that was sad and tragic. You know, it's what I noticed in that process is that I had far more power in that process than I ever did, you know, when I was someone that was a patient on a unit. So I want to stop talking and make room for other people, but I really want to share, like, later in the panel, like, what are some concrete things we can say to people when we're doing this work that are actually way more helpful than just standard assessment tools that kind of lead us just in one direction.
I just wanted to chime in really briefly and say that I once had someone tell me that mandated reporting turns social workers into cops in cardigans. And I think that analysis is important in part because it really raises that this is also a deeply racialized, classed, and gendered project. We know anti-Blackness feeds our understandings of what child neglect looks like and how we solve it. I've been observing workshops where practitioners can get continuing education credits for licensure. that are about creating this more elastic duty to warn understanding that basically scares providers into thinking that there are certain behaviors, subtle behaviors Muslim and Arab clients exhibit that can spot a future terrorist. And so there's even mandated reporting of like, I'm feeling hopeless or I'm struggling to adjust to a new country, that gets flagged as a potential terrorist that then triggers this like sense of duty to warn, because who wants to be responsible for not stopping a terrorist attack? So it's drawing on these racialized ideas of who we think is dangerous, who could pose a potential harm. And so I think we also have to work against how race and racism sort of inject themselves into the healthcare setting, as a part of our resistance to mandated reporting.
I really appreciate everything everyone has offered so far. What an amazing crew of folks. I wanted to share, there's a lot of the work that I do with folks with different types of care practitioners, professionalized and otherwise. I work with those who are most likely to be criminalized for not um, for not complying with mandatory reporting laws or systems policies, things like that. So most of that work is, underground. There's a lot of strategy around that process. And to address the initial question around, like, what is with this confusion and what's the impact of that confusion? And I think a lot of the confusion is certainly manufactured on purpose. And when I'm talking to professionalized mental health providers, so those who hold a license, any stage of license, whether it be like a preliminary license or they're in their internship phase, or all the way and all up to, very specialized licenses and credentials. Mental health providers who are licensed are one of the most controlled professional um, providers in any state. So we're much more controlled and confined and regulated, even more so than like a dentist or, a neurologist. And so it's important to think about those ramifications. And we already know, I think a lot of us here, I'm going to have an assumption that a lot of us know that what is on the law books, like what's written in the law, does not apply to those who are quote unquote breaking those laws, who are already, not who are experiencing marginalization. So Black, brown, queer folks, trans folks, disabled folks are more likely to be criminalized for not following a law, even if a law is vague, or in some areas not technically called a mandatory reporting law, but they're very much criminalized for doing so. And I think a lot of that leads to clinicians and practitioners not really knowing how to navigate subverting that and going against that for the sake of providing actual care and care that is not going to cause, carceral impact or being impacted by carceral systems. And so one of the things that, we work through together is trying to identify what are kind of these roots that we've been speaking to so far, what's leading to this and what is needed for you as a provider to be able to unpack that, dismantle what needs to be dismantled within your own care philosophy and how you work in your community. And then also what's needed for you to be able to do this care, because a lot of people are in their communities, they're essential to their community's well-being. And so their community members want their care providers to still be able to be present and do the work that they need to do. And so there's a lot of work around community resourcing and building so that the care practitioners are protected as they support and protect those that they're working with, as well as they, quote unquote, break the law to provide this care to families, individuals, and so forth. And I think another part of the confusion is, or another thing we need to kind of expand our thinking around is, we are about to have a presidential administration that is going to increase the amount of people were supposed to be screening, and things we're supposed to be asking. So beginning very soon, hospital workers in different states, including Texas, are going to be required to ask people's citizenship status, but people are not required to answer that question. But I know that we really need to prepare different types of providers in knowing how to navigate that and knowing that that will only expand. The amount of things that we are going to be, quote unquote, required to ask by law or some sort of systems policy are only going to increase in the coming years. And so it's really important for us as community members to begin to, kind of get ahead of that in a way and determine how are we going to respond instead? What are we going to put in place instead so that we are able to provide care with integrity that protects all of those involved? And so it's really important to think like what's happening now is only going to continue, and those tendrils are going to kind of reach farther out. So while this might happen in certain systems, right, like Texas hospital systems, what does that mean for mental health providers contracted with those hospitals, but they have a private practice? When will that kind of leak into people in private practice, healthcare settings of all kinds? So thinking strategically about what's kind of coming down the line is really important, because then we're able to get clarity and root out that confusion with some clarity and getting really clear with our community about what we are going to do as a community. And that community can be a small pod of people or a larger group of people in a neighborhood, a city, or a town. And I think working outside of institutions and systems are kind of our best bet in determining what it is that we need to get that clarity from that confusion. Because I personally work with people who have been forced by law enforcement and the sheriff's office and other places to report, even when nothing is really happening. There's active, things like that happen all the time. Folks that have been carceralized, criminalized, lost their livelihoods, they're not able to work in places. And so it's really important for us to think about what it is that our communities need. Even those, especially those care providers that are adamant about not engaging in mandated reporting, and need to be able to do that in a way that protects their ability to do that alongside their community members who are supporting that.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate y'all speaking to the misconceptions regarding mandated reporting, and especially how we need to prepare our communities as the requirements for reporting are expanded. I also really appreciate the conversation regarding how racialized these topics can be. I definitely experienced some of the cultural effects of that. Practitioners come with their own preconceived notions of how different cultures have different warning signs. So I really appreciated that conversation. And I also think it feeds well into our next question, which is, how do these laws and policies inform how individuals and communities interact with the mental health system? How is this informed by identity?
Repeat the question, please.
Sure. How do these policies and laws inform how individuals and communities interact with the mental health system? How is this informed by identity?
Joyce, you're gonna.
Yeah, go ahead, Shannon. You can take the first step.
Sure. I think actually, like Joyce said in the previous question, one of the things that mandatory reporting does is it trains people to not reach out to help from any formal systems. And it trains people, my world is in anti-violence work. And so what we know for people who've experienced harm to their bodies, for people who've experienced gender-based violence, there's layers of shame around that, and many people may only reach out one time to someone to tell them about their experiences. And what we know is that when your self-determination, when your bodily autonomy is harmed, Part of the way that we support people is supporting them in their self-determination and safety. And one of the things that mandatory reporting does is it erodes self-determination. It tells helpers, it tells mandatory reporters that you have to report even if you don't think it's going to be helpful, even when it's not wanted. And that is in direct tension with actually how we know how to show up for survivors and survivors of all ages. But that's particularly important when we're supporting young people, because young people have extra institutional barriers, because as a society, we say you don't get to make choices over your own body in the same ways as a young person. And so one of the things that mandatory reporting does, it cuts people off for support, and it trains survivors to actually not be transparent, to not share, to have to lie about their experiences in order to get their needs met. And we know that is profoundly harmful for what people actually need, which is contained, discerning, trusted people who they can share openly and then be in charge of what happens. Everyone should have the dignity to be in charge of their own story, in charge of their own information, and in charge of what happens with their story and their information. And mandatory reporting is literally the opposite of that. And so that's one of the many ways that mandatory reporting kind of prevents people from getting connected with support.
Right. And so Shannon started right where I was going to start. I was going to go back to the initial question, because the questions run parallel to one another in the sense that people are afraid. And I'll give you an example of when someone does not have a choice. When someone's in an intimate partner relationship and maybe they get injured and go to the hospital and tell the truth, or they need to call for assistance to save their life. Or like a parent that I'm currently working with who had postpartum. She experienced postpartum and she grew up in the foster system. And every time she had any type of anything, they sent her to a mental institution. She was 20 years old, had aged out of the system, had a baby, experienced postpartum, gave her baby to a family member, went to the hospital to check herself in because that's all she knew that happened when she became upset, angry, or had weird feelings. And they asked the questions, standard check the box questions, discovered she had a newborn, asked her where was the newborn and was it being cared for. She told them yes. It told them who had the baby, all of the things. And then they sent child protection services, as they like to call themselves, even though we see the outcomes and know the only thing they protect children from is success. They went to that home, took her baby, and you will not believe me when I tell you it is 8 years later and she has not gotten that child back. And the court case is still open and she's still fighting it. And so these are the ramifications of having people be mandated without clarity on what that means and for the purposes that they should report. And I know we're going to get to the place in this webinar, if there's questions and answers, where someone's going to ask that standard question. What about the children who actually need help? There are children that actually need help. I acknowledge that there's children who actually need help, but children didn't come here on their own. So if a child needs help, the family needs help, first and foremost. But even if it's a situation of extreme abuse where the child may need to be extracted from the home, the issue that I have is they're not in a better position when they're extracted. The system does not help. Children are aging out into homelessness. They're not graduating high school. They're becoming teenage parents, having their own children placed in the system. All of these things are happening, and people who work within systems are ignoring it while they focus their energy on parents that just need support. Simple support that would cost a lot less money than what we're spending and would utilize a lot less of people's time and energy, helping them to sort out what it is they need and provide it. Right now in New York City, there are over 800 lawsuits levied against foster care agencies that has caused harm to families, molestation, rape, mental, physical, emotional abuse, and many other things that we don't have time to go down the line for. But the fact of the matter is, we have all of these people diligently, excessively scrutinizing families when you turn your head the other way when it's your colleague who's committing the harm, the foster family that you're paying committing the harm. Suddenly you don't see the harm and there's no mandation. This is not about mandated reporting. This is a mechanism. Mandated reporting is a mechanism being used by the system to gather more people, throw the net out wide and see who you can capture. Pay attention. There are no CPS offices across the United States of America outside of Black, brown, and poor communities. They never anticipated that calls would be made on others.
Thank you so much, Joyce. And I'll just jump in here briefly to say, I've lost count of the number of people who have said to me, Caroline, I'm afraid I was too honest with my therapist today. I hear that on a daily basis. And so what we're dealing with here is a system that, you know, people are not being authentic or real with each other anymore. And so I think, like, transparency, I think it really needs to begin with those of us who are in mental health professional roles. We need to be transparent with people. That will help at least somewhat alleviate some of the institutional trauma. If we're saying, if you say X to me, I have to do Y. It is not for your own good. It is something that I am being asked to do by my job. If you want to continue this conversation and have it be about a friend that you know, I'm open to that. If you are looking for another space, because at my organization, we do have purely confidential spaces meeting online all the time. You can also be transparent. If you say X, I have to do Y because of this part of my role, not because, there's something wrong with you, and then offer, that alternative resource. So yeah, I think, if we're going to have support systems that any way resemble authentic human connection, I think it starts by being like really transparent about this stuff. Because too often, like, I was on a psych ward, this weekend supporting someone, and she wasn't even told that she could sign a 3-day notice to get out here in Massachusetts. So people aren't being transparent about what's going on, and they're not being transparent with people about the rights that they do have. And I think we got to start talking about that, or else there's going to be no trust. We're not going to be able to build it.
I want to jump in real quick, Caroline. Someone put in the chat, so why wouldn't a foster parent potentially need the same kind of support a nuclear family would need in a situation of abuse and neglect? Because it's not their child. If there are resources to be given, why would we take the child out of the home to put them in an abusive situation to give resources to the abusers outside the nuclear family? That is part of the problem. The things that we do have no rhyme or reason and makes no good sense. I can't legislate common sense, but if I have to give a resource to someone for the same issue, it's gonna be to the biological family. Why am I working through those same problems outside the home when the reason to take the child outside the home was to mitigate or remove those problems? I just wanted to address that. And someone asked me for some resources, and I'm going to check for those. So if you could also drop your email in the chat, I will write your email down and try to get you those resources.
Thank you for bringing that up, Joyce, and also Caroline. I think one of the impacts, I think there's been many amazing impacts, really important impacts already shared. But I think, Joyce, there was something you said that kind of sparked my thinking around one of the impacts of mandatory reporting is that it reinforces this capitalist and colonialist idea around outsourcing care and outsourcing outsourcing care and all kinds of things to a system that then we are unable to imagine how we can actually support people in our own communities and keep families or keep children with their families, and even what family means in every specific context. So we're no longer able to have an imagination around what to do when anybody is in great need of help, support, all of those things, especially when it comes to children or other people who have far less access to power, privilege, and protection within our current social systems. We get super scared and really insecure even about our own capacity to support people around us. And we fear that if we're not able to provide any sort of care, support, attention to those around us, then we are somehow, right, like there's going to be this huge catastrophe, and we are not able to imagine, right? So I think one of the big things is we can't imagine past, well, put them in a foster family who actually cares and give that foster family, ample resources so that child, is able to be resilient and heal and recover. We can't think past that. So that very question of why not give resources to foster families is an indication that we are not even able to imagine beyond what we have. And that is one of the impacts that mandatory reporting has on us that I don't think we think about all the time. And it speaks to also that is an impact of all of our systems of oppression, right? It keeps us from imagining a possible alternative future or a possible way of living together that doesn't anchor to these systems of oppression or not informed by these current social structures that we have in place. So one of the exercises that I think we can benefit from is removing in our minds or in our bodies, kind of removing the concept that we have to create this alternative from what exists now, because we're continue to be anchored to that, but to kind of orient ourselves in a different position together in community and build what might be possible based on what it is that we actually need and what we've been hearing from each other about what a better response to harm might be. What are the conditions that led to that we can change ever so slightly every day, every week, every time somebody comes to us sharing that something hard or challenging is happening? How can we respond differently? And I think building that kind of relationship practice with each other is really beneficial in expanding our imagination way beyond all of this. So we're not restricted to thinking about how can we reform what we have versus how can we make something different altogether that meets the needs of our communities and the individuals in it as well.
I appreciate everyone speaking to how the system creates a culture of fear and really causes tangible harm to those who need support. I also have a lot of personal experience with this. I was forced into the inpatient system when I was a teenager, and especially at that age, like kids need friends and have time, they need time to play and like explore hobbies, and they need love from their parents and support from their parents. But the solution instead was to, fearfully report me and keep me isolated in a psych ward. And the only thing that experience did was worsen my well-being. And, after that, I had no desire to interact with mental health support. Like, I didn't even want to talk to a therapist. And it seems like that's the experience for a lot of people who have had what they've said to a therapist reported. So given that mandated reporting causes so many harms, the next question, which Robyn was sort of pointing to, is what are the alternative approaches to mandated reporting that divest from carceral practices while still ensuring safety and accountability?
Oh, me. No. Mandate support, right? Isn't that what it's about? Why would we mandate an investigation, mandate prosecution, mandate family separation, when most of the things that lead to separation are minuscule things that could be resolved with a small amount of support, a little bit of resource, financial or otherwise? It makes no sense that we would put all this energy. But I'll tell you, I did a webinar about a year ago with Jane Spinack, is her name. She wrote a book recently to abolish family court, in family court, something to that effect. And in this webinar, as I'm interviewing her, she says, Joyce, I know you're an abolitionist, but this is a system that will never be abolished. I'm like, why is that, Jane? And she said, because it is the way that the middle class has earned a living since the beginning of time. She said, when you think about removing children from their home or policing, whatever it is, who's on the other end? Psychologists. Like, okay, so I'm in New York. In the state of New York, when someone gets arrested, if they get sentenced, they get sent upstate New York, which is white communities that are basically desolate to any type of office work. Everyone up there is a sheriff or a corrections officer. These people that are arrested get put on their census count, not on the census count of the communities in which they come from. So they're getting all these resources. It's super important. When we look at the parallel between foster children and the prison industrial complex, we see that children are strip searched under the guise of checking for marks and bruises. We see that if they're separated like prisoners, they're both separated from everyone, everything they know, love, and familiar with. They both eat what they are served. They both change homes and cells regularly. They both use garbage bags to change locations. They both have set visit days at set visit times. They both have oversight during the visit period. And they both utilize the same language, parole. If a child gets to go back home to their family, they are paroled with oversight during that parole time. And the same thing with a person who has been incarcerated. We have to understand that these things that we're fighting in systems were put in place purposefully to do what it is they're doing. And that's why they don't make sense. That's why they're only working to keep people employed who are in the position to turn their face and not acknowledge what's happening within the systems of harm, right? We're only blaming communities and parents. These children age out of the system, like I said, with no high school diploma and all these other things. That means, based on the standard, they cannot be productive members of society. They're then arrested for vagrancy laws. And we know the only way to have slaves in this country is through incarceration. So basically, they are preparing children to be the next generation of slaves in this country. And so the conversation is important in the context of what is happening. But I need everyone to look a little deeper and understand why it was put and placed the way that it is, because it's not about the mandated reporting. That's the distraction. It's about the capturing of Black bodies. I'm the worst person you ever want to meet when it comes to directions. So I always have my GPS on. And when I'm riding through a Black, brown, or a poor community, my GPS will not shut up. It's saying red light camera ahead, speed light camera ahead, police activity ahead, and on and on and on and on. And when I'm in a white neighborhood, the only time my GPS speaks is when it's saying make a right turn in 70 feet. And so when we talk about over-policing, why are we over-policing certain communities? Not because we inherently believe they're bad, but because we brought those people that are in those communities to this country to serve the purpose of slavery. And by any means necessary, we're going to make sure that happens.
Thank you so much, Joyce. I'm trying to ground in this dynamic around like my radical vision, which is abolishing mandatory reporting and family policing and all forms of policing. And what do we have to offer right now for folks who are trying to show up for folks who are struggling, are mandated reporters? And I really hear a lot of people sit with a tension around how to navigate that. And one of the things that I really try to remind people is that separating yourself from being clear about your role. So being clear about like if your role is as a therapist, if your role is as an advocate, if your role, like what is your role, and to be clear about that. And I say that because a lot of times we find people getting a little mushed up between their role as community care folks and being arms of the state. So for instance, you don't have to make mandatory reporting any easier. You don't have to, if you find you're in a situation you might have to make a mandatory report, you don't have to start asking bonus questions for the state. That is actually a really low level thing to do that can help keep somebody safer and help somebody have more choice on if and how they interact with the state and what kind of information is shared. Again, on many things like hotlines and people who are doing those kinds of care, if you're calling up a place and you cannot see those people, you can tell those folks whatever you want about your identity. And we can also be good allies to people who are trying to call and not have their information shared with the state by being, by how we ask questions, by how we do things like data gathering and information and holding, by centering folks in their self-determination and in their, like, and just in being in charge of their own information. And when people are involved with the state, we don't have to just pass them off to the state and say, oh, wow, well, the state's up in their lives, so I can't do anything. Many kinds of care workers can be doing parallel supports, and it's actually necessary to be doing parallel supports, both in providing care if somebody's experienced harm, if someone's needing care, but also in safety planning for the repercussions of involvement from the state. So even if you find yourself in a situation where a mandated report has been made, that doesn't mean it's over. That doesn't mean that's the end of the situation. And the amount of mandatory reporters I've talked to who the mandatory report is the last thing they do. So they don't tell anybody, they literally won't tell the person whose information they're sharing with the state that they've made a report. They're not doing ongoing safety planning. Um, that is such a low level thing we can do to say, great, we're going to make plans for people with people about what would happen if a police officer showed up at your door? What happens if a social worker showed up at your door? What would that be like? Let's make a plan for care for you, for your family, for your people. And so that kind of like co-planning with people as their supports and planning for repercussions of the state is the literal least we can do as we show up for folks. And you are not an investigator for the state. Don't make yourself a bit better mandated reporter by gathering extra data so you can report better to the state. Do not do that. I'll stop there.
I just want to say one more thing, and I'm not going to take over, but it's all just so ridiculous. It's very difficult for me to wrap my head around it because here's people who claim to be super educated, but there is a difference between education and intelligence, and clearly they're not very intelligent, right? You have mandated reporters, starch reporters want to report everything. And then I ask them, well, why didn't you, if you thought, because they'll say in defense when I do a talk, oh, I reported a family, I wanted to get them help. I'm like, you're lying, right? Straight, flat, straightforward, you're lying. You did not want to get them help. If you wanted to get them help, why did you keep it a secret? I was afraid of the repercussions. I was afraid that someone may attack me, hurt me, threaten me, all of these things. But if you really believe that you're helping someone, why would you be afraid of repercussions? Like, it doesn't even make sense. None of it makes sense because I've never been afraid that someone's going to beat me up because I helped them. The fact that you have to keep it a secret tells you that you're not helping. You know, but it's self-serving. And while many people were very unhappy with what Jane Spinach said in that webinar, I don't hold it against her for speaking the truth. She saw something that I didn't see, that people understand what's happening in the system. They work in the system. They retire after 30, 40 years with a great pension, like herself. Jane wasn't talking the way she's talking today when she was building up to get her pension. But suddenly, as soon as she retires, she's writing a book about in-family court. Why is that? Because she has extracted everything from that system that she can extract. Everyone knows what's happening. Everyone knows this system wasn't built to help. Everyone knows it doesn't help. And it's for us to figure out, how do we stop allowing them to do what they do under the guise of help?
Thank you for that. I wanted to chime in specifically about mental health systems specifically, and to think about this. I feel like folks are saying that there's this both and approach of strategies individual practitioners can use in the clinical setting, but also social movement work we can engage within our communities. And so I just wanted to talk through a couple of points that are specific to mental health settings. So like how do we ensure, back to Caroline's point, that every client has mandated reporting explained to them in the informed consent process, and that this is revisited multiple times throughout therapy. And then if somebody's veering towards mandated reporting territory, to remind people of their mandated reporting legal obligations, give people the option of talking in hypotheticals, letting clients decide for themselves how they want to interact with state institutions. We've heard being strategic about what to document and how to document things. So, if things get used against people, the documents are not so terrible. There are professional organizations like social work organizations that provide legal support. And so you can call people and ask them, is this mandated reporting? And you can document this legal organization said no, to protect yourself if people are feeling concerned about civil liability. How do you establish care plans or safety plans, not just for when the police might come knocking, but to sort of prevent things from rising to mandated reporting thresholds in the first place? And then there are lots of practitioners who just don't report and just say, as an ethical mandate, I cannot be a caring professional if I'm also an arm of the state. And so there are people who refuse to report. But then how do we think about this in relation to challenging carceral systems and processes by also, I think as Robyn was saying before, building alternative systems and care systems in our communities that are not tied to the state. But this also includes challenging police clinician collaborations. I'm a professor, and so I'm a mandated reporter. We've been trying to use our union to make it so we're not all mandated reporters, that it's just a handful of people. So we're just trying to challenge that designation. How to engage in political study with other practitioners, like we're doing here, to sort of unlearn some of the ways that racism, sexism, transphobia shows up in the clinical setting. And then how do we resist this idea that mental health is health, and so it's medicine and medicine only, and medical people are the only experts of mental health, to build community healing collectives, to hold grief circles with elders. There are all these possibilities that people have already been doing in life-sustaining and life-affirming ways that we can resource, build, and uplift, while we're also trying to dismantle these other harmful systems. So thinking about it as this both and approach, individual and structural, at the same time.
Yeah, thank you for adding that, Nicole. I think that's really helpful as well. One thing I wanted to add onto what you were saying was something that has been really supportive for folks that I work with, is knowing that they will likely encounter some sort of, there will be an impact to them not complying with these rules and laws. And so we work to build mutual aid networks for criminal defense, because sometimes civil or criminal defense, or to help fill the gap if there's job loss or they're put on some sort of suspension, or if they are dragged by their other professionals and their private practice is no longer getting referrals. And so we'll kind of create this financial safety net, or we'll work to do that because sometimes it's really hard to find people in your local community that are willing to be in this work with you. Especially once you have been criminalized for not engaging in mandatory reporting. Um, and so that's a really beneficial strategy that I recommend that people do proactively, is build a pod of other folks who are committed to decarceralized care, and liberatory care in all of the senses, and determine what do we need to sustain ourselves for when things happen, things go awry, because it's not if, it's when. And that's not like a scare tactic, right? But it's very realistic. You know, there will be somebody that is going to need a very practical resource like money, food, childcare, things like that, because they're having to go to court, they're having to go to all these meetings, all of these things. And so along with everything that has been stated already, which is crucial and important, I think that's one of them. Also, determining with your kind of care pod, for your practices. If you are a solo practitioner or you have a small collective or group of folks, or you're in an agency, or something like that, like working with other people, either physically around you, if possible, or, you know, maybe not geographically close, but you have some sort of connection and you're in a pod together. Determining what are the transparency statements that we need to be making with our clients that come to see us. What does that look like? What are the limits? How do we consistently talk about the reach of our power, in mandatory reporting and other reaches of our power? Because we can't ever say, well, I'm just choosing not to engage in mandatory reporting, and therefore now our power is equalized. Like, that is just not true, because as a professionalized provider, if our back is put against the wall, a lot of people will revert to complying with the law. So at any moment, clients need to know that at any moment their provider could change their mind, could change their stance, either out of perceived or real necessity or something else, right? And so I think it's really important as a professional, as someone who has some sort of, there is this power dynamic. It's really important to address that and work through that and figure out what does care look like, knowing that there is this power dynamic within social positioning, political positioning, all of these things. It's really important to address. And then having very clear kind of like statements or practices around what this is what I typically do, right? When someone comes to me and they say they're struggling with this, or they report this type of thing happening, this is typically what I do. How does that sound to you? What do we need to change to make applicable to you and your life and your needs? And also the impact that you could experience should the state come knocking, right? Because each client will have a different experience with that depending on their identities and other lived experiences. And so working with that, having a framework, this is what I do, and this is what I do instead. This is my network of care. These are the organizations, groups, or people that I have available should these things happen. And these are the steps I take long before even considering mandatory reporting, even though I know it's always there. It's always going to be there as long as it's a policy, either written into law or not. I think it's really important to talk about those things and build out those strategies with clients individually as they come in, and have really solid understanding and connection to people that can back you up in that and support in that. And if you don't have the people around you right now, because we can't plan for every single scenario, being connected in events like this and getting connected with people in the chat that have similar ideas and want to do this too is a really good thing to do. Kind of build your list of contacts, build relationships together, because should a need arise and you remember, oh gosh, I was on that panel and I remember seeing that person, we had this chat, it was great. I'm going to reach out to them and see if they have some type of knowledge or resource or connection that could really support my client and I through this process. That's also really important. So some very practical needs and strategies can be really beneficial in deciding to provide care outside the carceral state, and actively building what does care look like in our community with the people we have here. What does that look like outside the carceral state? And how do we work to educate ourselves and kind of dismantle that carceral care perspective and framework from our own selves?
Yeah, I really appreciate all that's been said. And just to highlight in the chat, for those that are looking for that support space, Wildflower Alliance does offer a provider support space on Monday nights for folks that have like been through our, alternatives to suicide training and are really wanting to use harm reduction, human rights centered approaches. And I think ultimately, yeah, just remembering that, systems aren't built for individuals. Systems were created for efficiency. But we're not working in factories, making widgets for Jeff Bezos. Like, we are working with extremely complex dynamics, human beings and their families. So I think just the lens that we go into when we have conversations, sometimes agendas, like if we hold an agenda really tightly, it can cloud our mind, it can cloud our response. But it really is like when working with these highly individualized moments in people's, lives, it really is the lens we want is I need to explore this versus I need to report this. I need to explore this situation. I need to understand what more is going on. And what I'll say is, I think a lot of clinical assessment tools that people get encouraged to use kind of suck. Like, they don't actually ask great questions for, truly understanding like a person's needs. So I think I am going to probably share in the chat just some, alternatives to clinical assessment that we use in some of our trainings at Wildflower Alliance. But really, like, being willing to come into a situation and explore that with the person. Some of the questions that I actually get a lot of use out of are like asking people, what is hardest about your situation right now? Tell me more about that. What's most difficult about this for you? You might be surprised by the answer. Another question I like to ask is, what do you wish more people understood about your situation? And asking these types of questions first before we go in with more clinical models, because some of those models, because they have the agenda, they're super leading. It's like, do you have a plan for suicide? Well, suicide isn't my problem. That's my solution to deal with these other problems that I need support around. And yeah, just, taking that time. I know a lot of us have had a lot of training and experience, and that's great, but each person is different. So, finding ways to discern like what they need from their community. And then also, if you've got fears and concerns, those are your needs. And finding a place where you can go to get support around those, I think, is really important.
Wow, thank you so much. Everyone shared such insightful things. The first thing that really struck me was when Joyce said that the solution to mandated reporting is mandated support. That just makes so much sense, especially when mandated reporting isn't to protect people, but is instead historically rooted in the surveillance and capturing of Black bodies. And I also think the idea that a lot of people do recognize that mandated reporting is harmful, but sometimes it becomes sort of a self-serving practice of just offloading your clients to the system so that you don't have to deal with like the complexities of the situation. I also really appreciate y'all saying that, yeah, you don't have to share anything with the state. Fundamentally, you're not an investigator for the state. So it's important to explore the situation and consider other helpful options. We can definitely let clients decide for themselves what they think is right, and then also be transparent about what we as practitioners, I'm not a practitioner, but what practitioners will report, and being upfront about and just letting the client know like this is here are the things that will make me need to report this. So at least they know if you are going to engage in mandated reporting. I also really appreciate the discussion about how practitioners can support each other and create a financial safety net as they navigate the system. That seems like a really tangible solution. And then finally, the both and approach of addressing structural issues while also doing things on an individual level. I think that leads really well into our next question, which is what are some concrete actions that individuals can take to address the harms of mandated reporting and bring change in their communities? What does this look like in terms of service delivery, policy, and on the legislative level or in advocacy contexts?
Well, I will share that through my work at Now in the Front Door, where the committee that I co-chair, we have worked with 3 major foster care agencies in New York. And we've had 3 major events with them, besides a lot of other behind the scenes work that we've done. And the event was called The Reckoning. And they were very public events. 400 people attended all 3 events on average. And the idea was to help the agency heads and personnel understand how they're being perceived as by the community and the role they play in family separation and the continued separation of families, because there's no accountability, utilizing words like due diligence to say that you help the family reunify, just like silly terminology that's empty with meaning. And one of the things that I pushed them with, and I will say it, one of the 3 foster care agencies have decided to give up their foster care component of the agency. And that will be happening probably within the next 6 months. This type of work is very important because there's no one I can change other than Joyce McMillan. I can point out the flaws and the faults and the concerns of everyone on this call, those on the panel with me and those who are just attendees. But at the end of the day, I can't force anyone else to change. I say this to say to every professional on this call, regardless to whether you're a parent advocate or a licensed professional, change begins with you. And if you know that mandated reporting is wrong, simply don't report. No one can say that you knew anything that could cost you your license because you didn't report. You can always say the situation was handled. If you have to do your own research, you have to call law schools. I have one of my closest colleagues on the call right now, Angela Burton, and she was a law professor for 20-something years. And we educate the commissioner and his staff and the mayor's office in New York City, the foster care agencies, and everyone else around what the law says regarding mandated reporting. Again, mandated reporting is there as a systemic issue to divide Black and Brown families and create chaos in Black and Brown communities. It's up to you to say that you're not going to participate in that. That's really, at the end of the day, where it is. Self-evaluation, self-growth, and the role that we play as individuals. Because I can say all day that I did it because the system required me to do it. No, you didn't do it because the system required it. You did it because you thought if you did not comply with their mandate, that you would not be in a comfortable situation. And so, again, it's about ourselves. So I just want to take that, my last moments on this call, to say, everyone, please look deep at the role that you play, because we can't force other people to follow the great ideas that we have, but we ourselves can lead by example and spread what it is we know and how it is that we're interacting with families. And one of the first questions I would ask a family if I was a therapist, I'm not, would be, do you feel comfortable fully disclosing any and everything to me that you may have a problem with or that you need to talk about? And I would want to know, if they say no, why? Because you can't get help from a therapist, a psychiatrist, or anyone if you feel this person is going to be mandated to cause further harm. I'm sitting in your office because I already need help. I don't need you to play a part in creating additional problems in my life. That's my spiel.
I saw there were some questions and conversations in the chat, excuse me, about legislative strategies and other kinds of things around, like, how do we actually change the larger conditions? And then I do actually want to talk about the individual strategies. But one of the things, so I'm based in Washington State, and one of the things we were working on doing was trying to figure out, could we get any less horrible conditions around mandatory reporting, because all that we've seen is an expansion of mandatory reporting and family policing. So every year in our state legislation, they add another kind of category of mandatory reporters to the list. It's just expanding and expanding and expanding. And so what can we do to pull any of that back? And so we have built out, with a lot of different coalition of folks, a legislative strategy. And what we found is we hadn't built the power to actually meaningfully move it. And also our window is probably closed for this moment. I can speak for Washington State in our legislative power. Some of the things we were looking at were taking away the criminalizing consequences for failure to report, because, like we've been talking about, there is a big fear that something bad will happen if I don't report. And I think sometimes people don't have a specific answer to what the something bad they think will happen is. And I'm not going to talk about it in nuance on this call, because I think we're actually talking about, like, nuanced things that could criminalize you. So let's have that in a private space, which I'm happy to do with folks. Andrea Ritchie always tells me I should not tell people to break the law in public. I mean, you can, but she told me not to. So, but let's talk about what those actually look like and what those strategies actually are. Because what I personally believe is that people are more concerned about the legal consequences, which is not the most likely consequence. So it is people are criminalized for failure to report. That is true. That is a thing you should be in conversation about making a plan around. It is not the most likely thing that happens. So in Washington State, over the last 10 years, there have been less than 10 people who have been charged under our failure to report laws, and even fewer of those folks who actually were convicted. So it's a small group of people who are actually criminalized. The other kinds of concerns usually are things like your job firing you, and where you make plans. And so I saw someone's also in the comments was talking about teachers unions and what are the professional, especially for professionalized helpers, what are the places that you can build power in your work. And so I think teacher unions taking up mandatory reporting is something we've been talking about with folks and organizers for a long time, because a lot of how the laws are applied actually are on policy basis, and a lot of what actually happens is at the organizational level, at the policy level, because the reality is people don't even know the laws anyway. People are just out here doing all sorts of things that sometimes have nothing to do with what your law actually says around what you're supposed to report and not report. And so building some power to actually change that legislative strategy, and we saw that there was no tolerance at this moment for removing the criminalized consequences in Washington State. So what do we need to do to build the power for that? Also, trying to build, which I think is a low level thing, and everyone acts like I'm talking about the most radical thing in the world, which is removing mandatory reporting and just having the default be discretionary reporting. So for me, that is a low level, meaning we're not dismantling child protective services, which I believe we should do. But under that proposal, you're not even doing that. You're just removing the mandate, and everybody who wants to report can still report into that system. Again, not my largest vision. That is the lowest level piece that actually is legislatively possible in different places. And our problem is building power to actually make those changes. I also want to say that if I can plead to mental health and other health providers to do anything, it is to care as much about your legal mandate towards confidentiality as you do about your legal mandate as a mandated reporter. What I hear a lot is people really prioritizing their role as mandatory reporters and de-emphasizing their legal requirement and commitment to confidentiality. And so if you are a therapist and you are telling anybody about something a client has said outside a legal mandate to do so, you are breaking their legally the legal confidentiality that they have. And so we should care about that and hold that with at least the same amount of weight as we do the sort of report. Because again, if you're over reporting outside your legal mandate, you are breaking people's confidentiality. Yeah, I think I'll pause there.
Yeah, just really appreciative again of like the grounding in how often these types of cases are actually litigated. The case law, you know, the legal precedent for stuff like this is minimal. These cases just do not occur with the frequency that people I think that it's commensurate to the fear people feel. And yeah, like systemically, I think, you know, so often, like the policies that are made in hospitals or like mental health settings, they are policies that are meant to avoid unlikely lawsuits, but they are not policies that focus on helping struggling people. If we have policies that are actually focused on struggling people, you know, there's going to be so much less to even report. It's just important to remember like why we got into this work and what the purpose is. I know at my organization we also have started doing doing family support. So HBN USA, the Hearing Voices Network, we now have friends and family groups, and we do direct support with families that, you know, have a loved one that's hearing voices, making sure that that family is given tools that they're not given by, you know, many clinical models, and yeah, that they're getting the support, the direct confidential support that they need. And this isn't like a super like sexy radical suggestion, but if for people that are providers that are like concerned about their vulnerability, um document the important work that you've done. Talk about like how you have supported that person in detail. Share like what their circumstances were and like the resources you provided, because yeah, in the very unlikely event that there is some sort of like review or hearing or licensure concern, that's often what gets looked at. And if you can show, if it's clear that you've really worked with this person and are, you know, working closely to address like their needs, it is a protective factor. Like people look at that in these rare cases. So, you know, focusing on what is the individual needs, getting those supports to that person, and then making sure there's like a record of all the great support that you offered is going to be helpful, you know, if you do come across like some sort of review process.
I'd love to address some of the comments in the chat regarding building power that Shannon brought up as a challenge to what was happening in Washington State. And um, obviously, Shannon, I can't speak to your experience there, so definitely, chime in and address that if you want, of course. But I think when it comes to, there were a couple of questions around building power or statements around that and what is the challenge around that and how do we build power? And I know that there's a lot of amazing ideas around how to build power and what has worked in the past, what's currently working for people now in various communities, and what we can do in the future. And it kind of goes along with how I'd like to explain it goes along with how I kind of view a couple of different perspectives or ways in engaging in abolition type work or liberation oriented care. There's some folks that really are galvanized around working to change policy or get something taken out of policy, right? The dismantling of a certain policy, and that's not my jam. I don't do that type of work personally or um, with people that I work with on a professional level. But I view it as if we are going to move away from mandatory reporting, or if we're going to move away from another institutionalized version of oppression, like the carceral, the prison industrial complex, or something like that. I work in mental health industrial complex abolition. So I think about if we are going to abolish this system that we have now, I primarily I thrive in working in what are we creating so that we can move away from it, right? Because we can't just topple over the mental health care system right now and be like, get down, run away, like we're done. Because a lot of people would be harmed in that, right? There are people who need support and care, and that is the largest structure and system we have in place for that right now. And so the work that I love to focus on as a person, an individual and in a professional way, is building the care systems that we need, that are rooted in our liberatory values, our abolitionist values and principles. Um, and thinking through what does that look like, because when we build those systems with people directly around us, whether they have a professional experience or not. There's someone in the chat that asked, is there a movement of people who are against licensure? And yes, I have a whole thing around care is not credentialed. Anybody, every single person on this planet has some sort of skill, capacity, lived experience, a spare room, an extra sandwich, something to give and offer when somebody needs support, extra care for whatever reason, whether it be they're experiencing a really scary or extreme mental state, or they're experiencing an abusive or neglectful situation, or they're really contemplating ending their own life because they don't have another solution that is viable to them right now. Everybody has the capacity to provide some kind of support in that. And so when I think about what does a liberatory care system look like, I think it looks like multiple care systems that are rooted and run by individual communities, right? So in my city, that could look like maybe we have 25 care networks that are interconnected, right? And each one has varying skills, different people with different capacities, and there's different resources. So that when someone comes to me and they say, this is happening in my home, I know who can provide that support should they want it. And say, there's these people over here, there's this group, there's this. These are the 52 steps we took first, right? Before determining a more quote unquote extreme measure was needed, whatever that would be. And so I think building power happens when we collaborate with people in our community to build those structures and different systems that are built and rooted in these liberatory perspectives and principles and actions. We do that, we build a systemic power, right? Because we show we have care systems that work. We have care systems that are providing care. They're not rooted or connected to the carceral state or the white supremacist capitalist state. They're not rooted in that or connected at all. They're completely separate, and they're interdependent with each other. When we do that, we have this power, we have grown a power that says we no longer need the mental health industrial complex anymore. We have shown that what we have built together as a community works. It will have to change in the future as we change and evolve as people. But right now, this is what's working. So more people can choose to turn away because now there are viable options in place, right? Right now, there are a lot of viable options in place that are disconnected. There are not a lot of interconnected networks of care in communities that can sustain the needs of the community right now. So when I think of abolition, I think very much of like, what are we building? It is about presence, right? We're taught abolition is about presence and action, building life anew. So what does that look like? In order to do that, we have to collaborate with people in our community, especially those with lived experience, especially those who are psychiatric survivors, or other types of survivors of carceral care. And in building that, and when we do that, we form a different type of power that can usurp what exists now. And what I will say is that when we do that, when that power is felt and recognized in our communities and by our state, there will be more push to squash our power out. And so we will absolutely have to plan for those harm reduction strategies, knowing that this is going to happen. Those carceralization rates will climb, right? Right now, there may be 2 or 5 or 6 in your state. When we build that power, there will be more of that happening. So we have to plan for that. Planning for that helps us build the power to sustain, to withstand that pressure without caving and crumbling in, because we don't have the fortitude for that. So it takes a lot of discussion, a lot of coming together with people around you, and starting small. A lot of people get really uncomfortable. They're like, I don't want to, the problem's so big, we have to solve this. People are getting hurt, people are dying. And the problem is important. There is an urgency to that. But when we approach building a liberatory possible alternative with urgency, we lose a lot of the connection to ourselves, land, and each other that we need to actually have to help us build something that has the power and the fortitude to withstand the pushback that we will get, because it will happen. But I think that when we do that in our individual communities, so if I know me and 40 of my peers and pod members here are doing it in my city, and I know some people in another city doing it, right? Then all of a sudden we have hundreds of people in a state or in an area that are doing this work. We have a collective power. And learning how to galvanize that power so it spreads is something that we figure out and learn together. And there's a lot of political education pieces that we can read or watch or engage with that teach us how to do that, and also teach us how movements had that power taken from them through movement capture or other strategies from the state to squash that, so we can learn how to prepare and withstand that going forward. But I really do think that creating and galvanizing that power happens by building viable liberatory possibilities of what care looks like, especially when things are in crisis mode. I hope that made sense.
Just to piggyback on some of the things you said, Robyn, PLAN, the Parent Legislative Action Network, which I founded and facilitate bi-weekly, has about 60 members, 30 that are active every 2 weeks. We do a lot of legislative work. My biggest issue is that we can't legislate common sense. And so I say that to say, as an example, to keep families from becoming entwined in the system, a piece of legislation I've been pushing in New York for 3 years has been preventing CPS from coming into the home without a warrant, Miranda rights for families. And it makes no sense that this legislation has not passed, because it's our constitutional right not to have a government employee into our home without a court order or a warrant. It's all a mind game that they play with us. So CPS tells the legislator, oh my God, children are gonna die if parents don't let us in. We're at their house because there was a call, serious concern. But the truth of the matter is 87% of children who are in the foster system across this nation are there for reasons related to poverty that are framed to be neglect. A very small portion, 13%, are there for reasons related to abuse. So we are overburdening this system with foolishness, and we're utilizing silly laws like mandated reporting and the prevention of passing laws that would make sense and keep families safe, for the silly idea that a child would die if a parent said CPS can't come in the house. And just for those on the Zoom today who might say there may be some relevance or truth to that, let me share with you. When someone calls to report a concern to the state central registry, no matter the state, they're asked a plethora of questions. And the determination is made as to whether or not it is an emergency circumstance. These calls are not treated like emergency circumstances, so they absolutely have time to go to court and get an order. The reason why I believe they circumvent going to court is because a judge may say, what you're bringing before me is not probable cause. And that would drastically decrease the amount of homes that they get to search and investigate. And so again, you know, there's things we have to do as individuals to help create the change. There are things we can push to legislate. If you're not a person who enjoys that, I understand there's a lot of people who don't enjoy it, but we can always support and encourage others in whatever state we are in to think about those type of legislations to prevent interactions in the first place. And I guess those are the things that I'm thinking about. And I, again, understand that I feel like I'm on a hamster wheel because I'm talking to people like yourself who understand so clearly the things that's happening and offering up really good ideas and solutions to how to mitigate or remove and prevent harm. But the fact of the matter is, the system is trying to stomp out all of those little fires we are setting to keep families safe, because the whole purpose of this system is to create harm and to disenfranchise certain communities or keep them disenfranchised. And even though I do legislative work and all of these other things, and I believe in everything that each of my panelists, co-panelists have said on this call, I also believe the biggest change is going to happen when we just say no more. And we have power. We as individuals have power. The power is not them. They've hired us to carry out their dirty work, and we don't have to do it. We do not have to do it. So just continue to think about not just all of the wonderful ideas you have, but the big part you can play, which may feel so minor. No snowflake will admit to causing the avalanche, but it was the collective snowflakes that created it. And collectively, we can bring the system down. Everyone has a part to play. Everyone has to play their part. And we can't preach change and be afraid of consequences.
Thank you so much for everyone's insights. We do have a few minutes, so I just wanted to hold space. I wanted to ask Nicole if you had anything you wanted to add to this. No worries if not, we do have time for one more question after this. Okay, so in the chat, there was a question that asked, are Black, Brown, Latinx, and differently abled youth overrepresented in victims of mandated reporting or family policing? And how might we address this issue?
I mean, the short version is yes, particularly Black and Indigenous families and people are overrepresented and over policed in family policing systems. Um, There's so many ways. I mean, honestly, Joyce's vision seems solid to me, which is like, we'll just no more. We just say no more. We just don't do it anymore. I mean, I think that's actually the meaningful answer to how do we change that. But I put in the chat earlier, and on the mandatory reporting is not neutral resource page, we have a couple of different articles and research and resources talking about how these systems are particularly crushing Black and Indigenous communities. And we also have some resources around uh, the intersection with disability justice and some work we've done around that. So just to share there, I'm not a fast, like the numbers on the top of my head. I do think, it's probably too nuanced for a panel, but as Caroline talked about some as well, we talk about mandatory reporting as a broad thing that actually has a lot of stuff that happens underneath it, and particularly where neglect is included in our mandatory reporting kind of landscape. The vast amount of reports are made related to issues of neglect, so are not made based on claims of sexual violence or other kinds of bodily harm to children, but they're based on questions of neglect. And neglect is defined in very vague and not specific terms that ends up being highly racialized. And I think we could just get rid of neglect as a reason for mandated reporting. I mean, we get rid of the whole thing, but particularly focusing on how neglect or the vast amount of reports that are made and are hugely disproportionately racialized in how those neglect and what communities are being policed through neglect kinds of reports.
There's also differences in how people interpret duty to warn mandates in the professional setting. So, a white kid might, express I want to kill my neighbor. And there's more intentionality about finding out, do you have a plan? Do you have the means? Do you have intent? Versus a kid of color, Arab, Muslim, Black, Latinx, makes the same kind of comments and is more likely to be reported as an imminent threat. So part of this is actually how do we unlearn our own biases that then show up in the clinical setting, so we're more likely to individually report certain clients as imminent threats to self or others than others, just like we do that with child neglect in other ways. So it is also on us, like the systems themselves are deeply racist, but we also participate in the systems in deeply racist ways. And so how do we also unlearn the ways that shows up in our own practices?
Thank you so much to everyone for sharing your experiences and insights with us tonight. Everything I've heard today has been so informative, and I'm sure it was for everyone who was on the call with us as well. Your commitment to fostering change within the mental health system and challenging the carceral logics embedded in mandated reporting is really, really inspiring. As we wrap up, we do hope people will stick around for a few minutes for an exciting programming announcement from IDA. But I do hope that tonight's discussion has offered each of us a renewed commitment to envision and build mental health systems rooted in care, autonomy, and non-coercive support, systems that genuinely prioritize the well-being of those most impacted by these oppressive structures. I also hope we can take away the many ways we can contribute to these changes, such as community support, mutual aid, and refusal to report, and also educating ourselves and others, and even practicing critical self-reflection in terms of how we are complicit in perpetrating harm within these systems. Thank you once again for being here and carrying this work forward. And I will now pass it to Nia for closing announcements and next steps.
Yes, thank you so much, Reeti, for passing it off to me. And yes, what an amazing panel. I'm just filled with so much gratitude for the wisdom in the room right now. So just want to thank again our panelists for your amazing insight and your wisdom in the work that you do. Thank you to our moderator, Reeti, for just doing a flawless, fantastic job holding the container for us today. Thank you to our tech team, Jesse and Noah and everyone for keeping that moving, and to our access team, the interpreters and the captioner. Very important that you're here today with us. Thank you to the committee of organizers who helped with this panel, for all those who are here. Like, we're eternally grateful for your work. And of course, thank you to everyone else who is here for sharing space with us and being on this learning journey with us. We are so grateful that you're here. So what is next? Please take a few minutes to share feedback with us via the form that will be dropped in the chat. IDA really relies on constructive feedback to ensure we create optimal spaces for our community to expand knowledge and foster communication, or foster connection, excuse me. So we would just really value your feedback. And we will also be sending a follow-up email. So that follow-up email will have a panel recording, a closed caption transcript, an anonymized chat transcript, a reading and resource list. So everything that was dropped in the chat today and all the questions everyone was having about if there will be a list of all the things that were talked about, it'll definitely be in there. So that will be sent to you. And there will also be ways to stay in touch with the panelists so you can see what orgs they're involved in and dive deeper into their work if you wish to do so. And then a panel feedback form. So if you don't get to complete it tonight, there'll be another chance to do that when we send it to you in our follow-up email. And also become an IDA member. So by becoming a member, you join a growing community of mental health change makers spanning people with lived experience, clinicians, family members, activists, artists, researchers, and advocates. So just how to join, you'll fill out a short form on our website, and you just have to affirm our principles and values, just be in alignment with who we are as an organization, and abide by our community agreements, the ones that we shared earlier today, which are also on our website if you would like to review those, and pay annual dues, which are tiered, and you can just see what those prices are on our website, which will be dropped in the chat as well. So our big announcement is we have a one-of-a-kind virtual event called the Mad Study Symposium happening on December 8th from 12 to 6 p.m. Eastern Time. So this is a 6-hour event. It will be live and recorded. And this event celebrates the launch of a groundbreaking book called The Mad Studies Reader. And that book brings together like writing and artwork from service users, activists, scholars, clinicians, innovative artists that are exploring the increasing solidarity and excitement around mad studies in the allied fields. So it'll bring together, like I said, artists, scholars, clinicians, activists, advocates, whoever is involved in the mad studies world. And there will be discussions and panels and presentations and artwork with various topics around mad studies. And there will also be a raffle, so you can get a chance to win a hard copy of that book if you so wish. Very excited about that, and we're looking forward to having you join us on that learning journey as we explore the field of mad studies as a field of inquiry, as a framework for transformation, and as a movement for social change. So we hope you join us, and the link will be dropped in the chat, so share with your networks as well. We're really hoping that this is a big event, and it's one of a kind, so we're very excited to see you there. And lastly, we have IDA's Transformative Mental Health Core Curriculum, which is, one of our seminal programs that we have, where we basically talk about everything that we talked about today. We get into the history of mad studies, alternative sources of care, just so many different things that the curriculum is about. So it's very broad for who can join: activists, social workers, clinicians, people who are just curious to learn more about transformative mental health. So we definitely encourage you to sign up. Yeah, and information will be dropped in the chat. So lastly, stay in touch with us. So our website, ida-nyc.org. Our Instagram is ida_NYC. Our Twitter is also ida_NYC. And our Facebook is ida.nyc. And I think that's it. Yeah, I think that's it. So of course, again, thank you so much for everyone being here. Thank you for sharing space with us, and we hope to see you again soon.